The motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Phil Twyford.
You know, I'll give this government credit. It's true that they lack an economic plan. It's true that they've left New Zealanders feeling disgusted by the sale of our gambling legislation to an Australian casino. It's true that they're on the long, steady decline to electoral oblivion in 2014. But at least, they've woken up to the fact that there's a housing affordability crisis. And I'll give them credit for that. They've actually worked it out. Stephen Joyce has looked at the polls. He knows there's a housing affordability crisis. He knows Aucklanders particularly are deeply concerned about it. And he knows that unless the government is seen to be doing something, unless they are perceived to be actually taking some action, then they're in deep trouble. And I'll give Nick Smith this. He has at least, since he took over from Phil Heatley as Housing Minister, he has at least conveyed the impression of activity. But the problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the very direction, the very nature of the policy that he is pursuing for social housing and for housing affordability more generally is undermining the values that New Zealanders have held dear for many, many years about the role of the state in guaranteeing a social safety net for New Zealanders who need the assistance of the government for a certain time in the provision of decent housing. He was in the cabinet of the government that was responsible for selling off 13,000 state houses in the 90s and left it for subsequent governments, particularly the fifth Labor government, to clean up that mess. And I say to the House, Mr. Speaker, that Labor will be in government before long and we will be cleaning up the mess that this minister is leaving. The effect of the reforms in this bill, Mr. Speaker, will be to weaken the role of the state. This bill offloads the responsibility of central government in providing income-related social housing for people who need it. The crowning glory of National's housing policy, Mr. Speaker, is to evict 3,000 state tenants. That is Nick Smith's, that is going to be his political epitaph. That is his great achievement as the housing minister, is to see 3,000 Housing New Zealand tenants booted out of state housing. And I asked Mr. Smith, is this an aspirational target, to boot out 3,000 state house tenants? Is that aspirational, or are you, Minister, absolutely confident that you can kick out 3,000 state house tenants? Is it simply an aspirational target, like the 39,000 houses that Mr. Smith says that he is going to build in Auckland? 39,000 houses he says he's going to build simply by opening the gate to new greenfields land on the fringes of the city and streamlining a bit of RMA consenting. By doing those things, Mr. Smith tells the nation that he's going to build 39,000 affordable houses. Well, we will see, Mr. Smith, we will see if you do that. Only the National Party would come to this House with an aspirational target in the area of social housing to boot out 3,000 state tenants while we are in the middle of the worst affordable housing crisis in living memory. This is this minister's idea of some kind of progressive reform, to kick out 3,000 state house tenants in the middle of a housing affordability crisis. That says it all, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's talk about some of the detail of what this bill does. The Social Housing Reform, Housing Restructuring and Tenancy Matters Amendment Bill. Well, one of the first things that it does, Mr. Speaker, is that it allows the community housing providers to get access to the income-related rent subsidy. So what is that? That is the difference between local market rents and what the state house tenants are paying under the current policy. And the context for this, it's very important to understand the context for this. Nick Smith wants to offload 12,000 state houses to the charity sector. That's his idea of strengthening social housing provision in New Zealand. He wants to flick off the worst, the most run down, the least fit for purpose state houses to a charity sector that is fragile and undercapitalised and under-resourced and ill-equipped to manage that kind of asset. It's exactly what National did to rural and country hospitals in the 1990s. They didn't want the state to have responsibility for providing health services for rural and provincial communities and isolated communities. So what did they do? They offloaded them to the community and said, here, we don't want to provide this essential service anymore, you go away and run it. Did they hand over the revenue and the funding streams and the capital to allow those community trusts to properly manage and maintain and upgrade that vital infrastructure? No. It was a recipe for decline. It was a sordid act of backdoor privatisation and simply the National Party's habitual response, and that is to offload and devolve the very functions that New Zealanders expect the state to take responsibility for. They are cynically disposing of a big chunk of the Housing New Zealand estate, the least fit for purpose houses, to NGOs. They are not handing over the capital that would be needed to properly maintain and ultimately upgrade those assets. It's a recipe for decline. Labor supports the social housing sector, sir. We want to see a government social housing program that works in partnership with community housing providers. But that is not what this is about. This is not an act of genuine partnership between government and social housing providers. It's shuffling pieces on the chessboard, sir, by moving a big chunk of the social housing estate out of government control into the community sector. Not a single extra Kiwi family in need will be housed by this move. It won't make a blind bit of difference to the number of people who are currently languishing on waiting lists, sir, desperate to get a decent roof over their heads. The second thing that this bill does is that it passes over to the Ministry of Social Development the responsibility for assessing the need and assessing eligibility of State House tenants. And the justification for this, sir, is that the purpose, the agenda of this bill, of this set of reforms, is to try and establish a kind of a quasi-market for social housing in New Zealand, in which Housing New Zealand will be set up to compete with community housing providers. And if you're going to have that kind of setup, then what you've got to do is have a neutral party that assesses the need and eligibility. And that's why Nick Smith wants MSD to take it over. Well, my concern, sir, is that this is just the latest move by the National Party to depower, to strip away the functions of Housing New Zealand. It is already a weakened organisation. It is already dysfunctional. The Phil Heatley's smarter, fairer, faster fiasco restructuring of Housing New Zealand, which has seen tenancy offers taken off the front line, Housing New Zealand tenants forced to engage with the organisation through an 0800 number. It has weakened the organisation. It has driven up tenant churn and turnover. It has driven up fraud. It has driven up non-payment of rent. It has been an absolute disaster. The organisation is in no state. It is in no state to do the kinds of things that Nick Smith is asking it to do, and he wants to weaken it even more by taking away what is a central function of a social housing provider, and that is the assessment of eligibility. So Housing New Zealand is going to be left simply as a tenancy manager for the rump of the old social housing estate. Minister, you may as well just get Barfoot and Thompson to basically manage the tenancies. Why not? Just go the whole hog. You clearly don't believe that the state has a role in providing social housing for vulnerable people. No, you don't, Minister, and your party doesn't. And everything that you've done as a party in the last 20 years says that you don't believe in the importance of the role of the state in delivering income-related social housing. So, given the logic of these reforms, you may as well just hand the whole lot over to Barfoot and Thompson. This National Party has an ideological belief that the state cannot do good in this area. So every opportunity they get, they want to devolve, contract out, fragment, fritter away Housing New Zealand's role as a social housing provider of income-related rental housing. Labor would like to see Housing New Zealand revitalised, rebuilt, working in partnership with the social housing sector, sir. The final point I want to make is applying reviewable tenancies to 3,000 people who will be booted out under Mr Smith's
Sorry to interrupt the honourable
target.
member. His
It's
time
the
has
wrong
expired.
measure at the wrong time, and we will be voting against it.
Order. I call Paseta Sam Lutuinga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and speak on this, the first reading of this